This is my account through my photos of my attempt to build a model of HMS Squirrel at 1/48 scale. You may be wondering why I'm beginning this talk with a picture of my semi-completed model. It's because I can find no other representation of the ship, which suggests to me that she was just another commonplace vessel within the Royal Navy at the end of the 18th century. According to the listings that I can find, she was simply known as a 24-gun post ship, even though in some of the literature I've seen she is referred to as a sloop or as a frigate. Why mention Pandora? Well, because I spent quite a few years scratch building a model of her, and I wanted to try my hand at a later but similar sized vessel, and to build her so that she was much more open, allowing her construction to be viewed, not least her internal workings. So, back to HMS Squirrel. She was designed by Edward Hunt and built at John Barton's yard in Liverpool. Launched in 1785, she had a career of some 3 decades. In the company of other vessels, she did take a couple of privateers and served on station in Jamaica, on the African coast and Halifax. However, it seems that much of her life was spent in the North Sea and in the Channel service. Perhaps one claim to fame, small though it is that in 1794, for a year, her captain was Israel Pellew, younger brother of the much more famous frigate captain Edward Pellew. Of course, the last decade of the 18th century were restless years for the lower decks of the Royal Navy. And lo and behold, within the Admiralty records, there is a reference to discord on board. In the February of 1795, a letter was sent to the Admiralty from the crew saying, "We have no encouragement either to serve king or country with such usage," and further, "We never will fight like British subjects under the command of these officers." And finally, "We have no liberty, nor dare we speak for our rights." I should mention my sources for this brief history. It's mainly from Riff Winfield's book, British Warships in the Age of Sail, 1793 to 1817, and also James Davies' book, Tempest, from which come the quotes. I've made every effort at getting this correct. However, if there are errors, it will be corrected at the earliest opportunity. So why in particular Squirrel? Well, whilst similar to Pandora, she is slightly later in date and designed by a different naval architect. Also, there are some very good original plans of her in the National Maritime Museum, along with a copy of the contract for her attributed to her build by the museum. It was in January 2021 that I got copies of all these documents and started to make my own plans using a program called TurboCAD Mac. I had completely underestimated how long it would take to produce these. Eventually, I was able to get into my workshop, and of course the first task was to make sure I had a decent baseboard. I spent a long time ensuring that it was flat and that there were 2 rails set either side, and that the full breadth plan was properly secured to it. Subsequently, the rails have been incredibly useful, as I can run a gantry along them and also hold other tools such as set squares, which can be firmly fixed in place on the baseboard. I'm not quite sure why, but I struggled to make the keel, stem and stern post. Maybe at this stage I was looking for too much perfection. However, I did have 2 attempts at it. I should mention that the wood used for most of the models so far has been kiln-dried pear. I have also discovered the use of traditional pearl or hide glue. I use a brand called Old Brown Glue, as it can be reheated over and over again and not deteriorate. The advantage of using this, especially with someone like myself, who is forever redoing work, is that with a bit of heat, a glued joint can be broken with ease and easily re-glued after adjustment. I do use a modern PVA glue for those parts that need particular strength. Superglues are out for me as I am allergic to them. To cut the keel's rabbet, I made my own tool, a small blade with an adjustable guard which can be dragged along the edge of the keel pieces, gradually carving in the rabbet. And whilst talking of tools, wherever possible, I avoid using mechanical tools such as a milling machine, as I much prefer using hand tools. I mention here the Veritas miniature tools, which really are excellent for this sort of work. I get a great deal of pleasure in doing things by hand. Prior to attaching the stem and stern posts to the keel, their deadwood was made, fixed in place, and the rabbets or ledges for the cant frames were cut out using chisels and my miniature hand router. Once both stem and stern posts were completed with their deadwood, they were attached to the keel, and the backbone of the vessel at last was in place. The remainder of the deadwood along the keel could be added. Now it was time to work on the hawse pieces and the knights' heads. First up were the foremost cant frames, a half frame, followed by the knights' heads, which marked the space between which the hawse pieces were to be fitted. Spacers were used to get the correct gap between each of the hawse pieces. Once all was in place, the bow section was faired up. Now to the stern. As in the bow, the first thing to fit was the aftermost cant frame, again a half frame. This allowed the two lowest transoms to be positioned as they were slotted into the inner stern post. Then came the next cant frame, the first full frame onto which the ends of the next two transoms were fitted. Now to the frames, the cant frames followed by the square frames. All the frames were made in the same way. From my CAD plan, I lofted each frame, then printed it onto an A4 piece of paper. When cut out, the paper templates were glued onto pear sheets of the appropriate frame thickness before being cut out on my fret saw and then being faired. The frame parts, futtocks and floors were then set and glued together in my home-made press, along with the chocks, ensuring flatness to the frame. To make sure they were accurately assembled, they were laid over a lofted plan of that particular frame. Once set, the frame was removed from the press and again faired up. The square frames at their tops had horizontal wooden bars added, showing the centre line, ensuring accuracy when set onto the keel. Tree nails were inserted through the frames into the chocks. I found the setting of the cant frames difficult. However, after several attempts, I made two jigs, you might call them open boxes, one fore and one aft. These sat on the baseboard with the correct shape of the hull at the shear line, showing the position of each of the frames. This time I obtained a reasonable accuracy in setting them up. Thank goodness for old-fashioned pearl glue. As the main frames are double frames, the two parts were glued together before being installed. Then they were glued in place, using the baseboard gantry across which was fitted a flat board, with its base flush to the baseboard and at perpendicular to it, upon which was taped a print of the frame's plan. Once the gantry was in the correct position, the frame was set against the print and the board and held in place whilst being glued onto the keel. When the main frames were set in place and secured with tree nails, the filler frames between them were added. I then secured the whole hull to my baseboard by adding guy ropes with tensioners to the tops of some of the frames and spacers in the centre of the vessel between the horizontal frame bars. Above the baseboard, 2 lines running parallel and above the centre line were stretched. By sighting down these and along the keel, I could make sure the model was upright and the hull lying correctly. Now I could begin strengthening the hull. A temporary shear rail was glued on. You may also notice that here the gunport frames have been pre-cut before insertion, ready to receive their sills. Unfortunately, when I came to check their positioning, some were quite out. So these shortened frames were removed and replaced with full frames reaching to the top of the timberline, ready for a second and later attempt at the ports. Then came the stern timbers. The jig I had made for fitting the cant frames proved to be a perfect guide, giving a stable platform to set the timbers in place on the top transom. Once the jig was removed, I made a bracing piece to replace it, making sure the timbers remained safe and secure. With the guy ropes, as I have called them, removed, it was very apparent how rough the external hull was. I knew this would be so, as in making the frames I purposely did not bevel their sides, but at least the hull was sufficiently robust to allow it to be turned upside down. And with the model turned upside down and fixed firmly in place upon the baseboard, the process of fairing the outer hull began. I used various tools for this, not least spoke shaves, card scrapers, and sandpaper. Having got the hull nicely smooth, it was time to make some of the longitudinal stringers. The first was one of the ribands. To do this, the hull was placed back in its correct position on the baseboard, and the baseboard raised, allowing access. And now a slight diversion, showing how I measure vertical heights on the outside of the hull. As you can see, a ruler is clipped onto a set square, and a pointer with a solid base is moved up and down to the correct height. This then is transferred onto the hull. I began making the whale by marking it out, strake by strake, with tape. With a collection of clamps, not least my homemade hull clamps, the construction began. Here, the whale is nearing completion. And finally, before turning my attention to the hull's interior, using the same method as with the whale, the shear rail was added. Then both were ready to be faired. And now to the interior of the hull, and the fairing process began using many tools, not least the ever-faithful card scrapers. The keelson pieces were cut out and shaped, and then fitted. Here the gantry was again in action, as it provided a good platform against which pressure could be put on the pieces below when gluing. At the keelson's extreme ends, both fore and aft, the pieces were steamed and then bent into shape with the rise of the deadwood before gluing. The foot whaling was added. Then it was back to the external hull. Using my plans, the cutwater was made and fitted. A cradle was fashioned, allowing me to lie the model on its side. Tree nails were added to the whale. Incidentally, where it was difficult to add tree nails, especially internally, I found that the end of a syringe needle pressed into the wood leaves a good enough impression to look like a tree nail. With the tree nails in place and faired down, it was time to protect the hull from the top of the whale to the keel. I have an aversion to modern wood finishes, mainly because I'm not experienced enough with them, so lack the confidence to use them. Instead, I prefer traditional substances, and so I applied my own mixture of turpentine and beeswax, a wood polish. It needs some persistence with much elbow grease, but a lovely shine and colour to the wood can be had. After all this woodworking, it was a pleasant break to do some metalwork, making the gudgeons and their bands for the rudder. The parts, of brass, were soldered together using silver solder. The gudgeons' braces had holes for their fixing bolts drilled into the side, and with the help of Birchwood Casey brass black solution, blackened. They were then fixed onto the model using bolts made of brass rod, with their heads preened over once inserted into their pre-drilled holes. To give these bolts more holding power, I always rough their shanks up with a metal file before insertion. I also fixed the fish plate at the stern and the horseshoe plate at the bow. You may also note that there is a hole where the fashion and filling pieces should be, under the bottom transom. Later on the build, I remembered these and fitted them. Back to the interior of the model. I had to decide how much of the bottom frames I wanted to remain exposed. Bearing in mind that I want to see as much of the hull's construction as possible, I decided to install just the thick stuff between the foot railing and the lower deck clamp. To complete the stern timbers, the various transoms, with their appropriate round-ups, were made and installed. Tree nails made sure they were firmly in place. Breast hooks and crutches were fashioned and glued into place using brass bolts to firmly fix them. Following them came the mast steps. A note on how eventually I fashioned my gun and sweep ports. The position of the bottom sill was marked on the frames. A small card scraper was taped on as a guide, allowing a fairly straight cut with my smallest handheld saw blade. A similar process was repeated with the cutting out of the top of the port. The heads and feet of the frames were faired up. I used a solid square block of wood made to the scantling of each port to check for correct sizing. Once the correct opening had been made, a mortise for the sill to sit in was cut into the side of the frames that formed the port's wall, and the sill was inserted, ensuring a snug fit. Finally, the edges of the sills were filed down and sanded flush with the hull. I find timber heads fiddly. To carve them into the tops of the frames either before or after the frames are in place is not easy. Instead, once the tops of the frames have been trimmed down to their timber line, I prefer to make the heads separately and attach them onto the frame tops with a small dowel. The gantry once more came into its own for measuring height above the baseboard inside the hull. Knowing the height of its top beam, a square with a movable ruler set to the correct depth was placed on its top and clamped into place. X marks the spot where the ruler end meets the hull. Using the method just described, I could mark the top line of the lower deck clamp along the side of the hull. After marking this out with tape, the process of installing the clamp began. I should add that its construction, along with all the other planking, was easily done, as with the plans from the National Maritime Museum, there is an internal and external planking plan for the vessel. And so the first of the decks, the platforms. As these are flat, they could be made on my bench. As you can see, I decided to plank the port side, leaving the starboard side open. The planks are lime, as I thought this would not only introduce a change of colour, but would be more representative of an actual wooden deck. The fore and aft platforms were installed, along with their ironwork, brass, and their lodging knees. Whilst a bit fiddly, I was able to install the bulkheads that run beneath the platforms. Around the mainmast partner are the bottom of the pump's tubes, their wells, and the housing that surrounds them, along with the shot locker. As the wells will not be seen, I made a bed with a dowling at its centre for each of the tubes to rest on. The housing around the well and the shot locker was simply made, and perhaps came out a little bit skewed. I didn't worry about this, as again, it's going to be very hard to see these details once the model is fully made. Ladders up to the fore and aft platforms were made, the well housing and shot locker fixed in place, so that now the lower hull and hold was virtually complete.